Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Cardano and its native token ADA, Dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, it's been a little while since we did a video on Cardano. We actually did one a few weeks ago, but I wanted to follow up on the idea that we presented in that video, right? So essentially, what we talked about was ADA kind of repeating this pattern, right? Where you have this wedge, and I said that if it, continues to track, you would likely get a sizable pullback, kind of either in December or January, back to the prior highs from the previous year. So let's follow up with that because at the time ADA was at a buck 20 and it was a little hectic, a little crazy. The FOMO was running, and I always prefer times like this because you can actually sort of think a little bit easier, people a little bit more rational. So let's go take a look at what's happened. So ADA, if we sort of draw that same thing out onto the chart, ADA has essentially, it's in this, like, I guess, ascending broadening wedge, maybe. And I don't even know if technically that's what it is because it did sort of break down right here. But the pattern that I want to talk about is where ADA gets this move, sort of like a 1-2 move. See that? 1-2. And when it did it last year, it pulled back to just below that high. Now, ultimately, it did go a lot further down, but the first pullback was right there. Okay? Now, if you go back to last cycle, there's actually a really similar thing that happened, right? Where you kind of have a similar type of wedge. It's a little dubious to draw it like that, but just bear with me. But what you'll notice is that there was also sort of this top here, 1-2 top, came back down to the bottom of the wedge, went below it, kind of like it did over here, right? And then went back up. And then here, and I'm not saying it's going to play out like this, but I want to go through the outlook here. What happened is that ADA had a larger pullback, and it actually pulled back here, where it actually went below the prior highs from the prior year, but it just kind of stopped right there. Okay, so if you look at it over here, one of the things I suggested, if you guys go back and watch the video, is that at the very least we would see it retrace back down to the prior high, right? 80 cents. Okay. Now, it already went to 76 cents. So it's already made a sizable drop. And if it repeats last year, it's always possible that's it, right? With that said, if it also repeats last year, you can see the drop lasted many weeks. Like, it wasn't just sort of like a one drop type of thing. It actually lasted a few weeks before then moving back up. And if you take last cycle as any comparison, then what you'll notice is that it dropped further down into it, right? Where you kind of dropped, not it didn't go like below this low, but it did go kind of like in here, right? Now, if it were to go that low, that would be a little bit lower than where we are right now, right? I mean, it's possible that it continues to drop into the end of the year. In fact, this drop, I mean, it occurred in a halving year, right? I mean, it occurred in August, September, so it's not exactly the same timing, but you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Now, the other way to look at this, though, is to say, what if this is not where we are, but instead we just came up to this point, right? Because this point right here occurred in early December of the Bitcoin halving year, and right here it occurred in late November of the Bitcoin halving year. It then pulled back. When it had its pullback, it then pulled back, not to the prior yearly high, but a little bit higher than that. So you could try to make that argument, right? That it's here and not here. I think that, I mean, with where things are right now, right? I mean, it seems likely that Bitcoin dominance is going to go up for at least the next 2 to 3 weeks. It's kind of my base case right now, at least the next 2 to 3 weeks. And the reason I say that, a few reasons. One reason is that Bitcoin did the same thing last cycle, right? I mean, dominance did the same exact thing last cycle. If you go look at Bitcoin dominance, it also kind of had this like fake out where it dropped in November and then it had like a final surge in late December and early January. You can even say take a bar pattern here and identify what I'm talking about, right? Where if you take this and you overlay it, you can kind of see a very similar drop by dominance in November of last cycle of the halving year. It then got one final surge in the late December, early January, and then dominance fell in the post halving year. So that's something to be aware of. Now, the reason why that's important is, obviously most people watching are probably going to care about the USD valuation, but really you should more so care about its Bitcoin valuation than the USD valuation. I think what's essentially happening, and maybe you can understand where I'm coming from, and I don't expect everyone to agree with this, but what I kind of think is happening is that ADA is chasing whatever the most recent narrative is, okay? And it's not just ADA. The reason I do a lot of analysis on ADA in this case is because it actually behaves in a lot more of a predictable fashion, I have found, than some of the other altcoins. It's kind of like middle of the road, where it's not, it's not going absolutely crazy at certain parts of the cycle and then having to drop a lot more later on, but it's also not giving you the worst returns. It's kind of in between, right? It's kind of in between. And what's interesting about it is it kind of chases every single narrative, right? In terms of like, what's going on in crypto, but also what's going on in the macro, right? So down here in late 2022, it was sort of like, all right, we're heading towards a recession. And then it was, just kidding, we're not. Let's head towards an expansion. And then, summer of 2023, it was like, oh, just kidding, back to recession, back to not recession, back to recession. And it kind of keeps going back and forth. And I think the reason why it isn't yet breaking out either way, whether it be to the downside or the upside, I think the reason is because there hasn't really been a compelling reason to believe that either narrative is true just yet, right? I mean, it's basically like every time we get down here, initial claims in the market, macro side, are still low, right? So it's like, well, markets need a reason to go down, not a reason to go up. So you get this time-based capitulation. But then when they get up here, ADA's looking for a reason to break out, and it keeps not breaking out, right? It keeps not breaking out. It had a very similar pattern last cycle where eventually it did break out, right? It did eventually break out, and obviously the rest is history. Eventually. It took a long time for it to break out. It didn't really break out until January of the post-halving year. But it did eventually break out. But I think the reason it hasn't broken out yet is because, Bitcoin dominance, it hasn't necessarily topped. It's possible that it has, but, when you get Jay Powell coming out and saying, hey guys, no QE for you, the degens can go complain about it somewhere else, can cry in the corner, no QE for you. And so if you overlay here total assets held by the Federal Reserve, you'll see that, they were expanding their balance sheet quite aggressively when ADA did break out of this wedge, right? You can see that pretty clearly. And it was getting rejected from this wedge while you had quantitative tightening. Do you see what I'm talking about? So essentially what you're seeing is, ADA is wanting QE to return, but it just keeps not returning, right? And Powell keeps saying, not yet. And when he says not yet, ADA then gets these rejections. Last cycle, we only had this pattern once, right? This time it's been going on a lot longer, but arguably because QT, quantitative tightening, ended a lot sooner last cycle, right? Here, it never really ended. It's still going on. And ADA didn't break out here until after QE came back. And we don't know yet when QE is going to come back. So I think that is arguably the consideration to make. Now, this, though, does not have a clear correspondence to ADA USD when QE began, right? It was just kind of down here. It wasn't really doing anything special, but that was when QE began. Now, look at ADA Bitcoin, which is what you should be looking at. When QE began last cycle, that was around the time that ADA USD bottomed. Or sorry, that was when ADA Bitcoin bottomed. ADA Bitcoin bottomed when QE returned. And that's the reason, right? That's the reason why you could argue that ADA Bitcoin has had such a sharp correction recently, is because, there's no guarantee, as much as we want QE to return, just hasn't yet. When I told you guys back over here in 2021, 2022 that ADA was going to go to 400 sats, a lot of people didn't believe me, and they really disliked that view. But again, it wasn't based on what I necessarily wanted to happen. It was more so based on what I saw happen last cycle, right? I was a product of my own experience. And if quantitative tightening continuing made ADA Bitcoin go down, that's why I thought, hey, it's possible that it just simply goes back to 400 sats. Now, it went to 470. 470. That's pretty close to 400, right? I mean, it's in the 400 to 500 sat range, which is arguably close enough, right? It is arguably close enough. But there is a case to be made. There's always a chance that it puts in, say, like a macro higher low. It could put in a double bottom. It could even sweep the low if dominance is going to go up even more, right? And that's kind of the thing to consider here, is that if ADA Bitcoin were to sweep the low, it would be due to the fact that all Bitcoin pairs are unable to escape this reality of the, sort of the oscillators at best reality, right? So if they can't escape that reality, then obviously, it's always possible that ADA Bitcoin gets, one final drop, could be a higher low, could be a lower low, could be a double bottom. But just remember, when alt Bitcoin pairs got this collapse, this was at the very end of the halving year, right? This was December going into early January, right? So if you got a drop like that by alt Bitcoin pairs now, you can see that it would actually take you to the range low, right? It would take you to the range low if you got something like that. And I kind of like, it's sort of this like internal debate of like, does it have to happen? Like, is this time different? And there are examples where an altcoin doesn't always go to the range low. So it's possible that the collective altcoin market doesn't go to the range low. The only reason I'm even giving that consideration is because Bitcoin dominance already went to 60%. But like an example would be XRP Bitcoin, right? XRP Bitcoin was a great example from the last cycle. And I don't care if you don't like the coin. I'm not asking you to like it. I'm just saying, like, look at the example. There are times where you kind of have a range low. This is XRP Bitcoin last cycle. You have sort of a range low and a range high. But last cycle, XRP Bitcoin didn't really go all the way down to the range low. But because it didn't go all the way down to the range low, it also never went back up to the range high, right? So it's almost one of those things where, like, okay, fine. If it doesn't go to the range low, then so be it, right? So be it. I'm talking about ADA Bitcoin, right? If it doesn't go to the range low, then so be it. But you run the risk of repeating what XRP Bitcoin did, where it then doesn't go back up to the range high, right? And I think that's kind of an outcome that you kind of have to be comfortable with, right? I mean, and to me, again, I have this sort of this like internal debate. I'm like, well, 470 sats is essentially 400 sats, right? Like, why do we got a nickel and dime? Why do we got to nickel and dime this stuff? Because, I mean, the grand scheme of things, it looks pretty close, right? It looks pretty close. But I suppose the counterpoint would be to go back and look at something like XRP Bitcoin and say, well, technically speaking, last cycle, XRP Bitcoin had a really nice rally in November of the halving year. It rallied about 170%, and then it still went on to put in a lower low, right? It dropped 85% after a 170% rally. Now, ADA Bitcoin, I believe, went up more than that this cycle, I believe, when it had that little rally right there. It's about the same. It's a little bit more, about 194%. But I mean, again, like the XRP Bitcoin valuation kind of shows you what is possible. Sometimes you can get those rallies and then it could come back down. And then the other thing to at least consider is that last year, we actually got a high by ADA Bitcoin in December, and then it just kind of faded from there. And I'm not showing you that to like scare you or to FUD or anything like that. It's just like that's what happened. And I don't control what happens, right? I'm just showing you guys what happened. And when I look at a chart like this, I do wonder. The thing about last cycle was that you got this nice, bottom in the market where it held support for months. We never really got that for ADA Bitcoin this cycle. And I'm not saying you have to have it. There are times where it doesn't play out like that, right? If you look at ETH Bitcoin in 2016, you never really had a double bottom, right? You just had a low and then a higher low. And that was it, So I don't want to, make it seem like it has to play out like that. But if sometime next year we're looking at this and it just ends up playing out like this, where it kind of does that and then comes down here to 400 sats, and then late next year starts going up into 2026, just know that it's not entirely unheard of. In fact, the major spike from ADA Bitcoin in the 2016-2017 cycle didn't even occur until almost 2018, right? It was at the very end of 2017. The very end of 2017. So there does exist a scenario where this just ends up being a lower high for a little while on ADA Bitcoin. And perhaps the reason why we haven't yet seen this low kind of the structure here is because the Fed never began QE. That could be the reason, right? It could just be that the Fed never began QE. And so, again, it doesn't mean that you can't make money on alts, right? I mean, I said it is a good chance to diversify into altcoins when Bitcoin dominance hit 60%, and a lot of alts went up several 100% since then, including ADA. So I'm not suggesting that you can't make money on those moves, but as, from an academic perspective, right? From an academic perspective, if you told someone that didn't own ADA, never heard of ADA before, right? If you told someone that you feel bad because you missed the boat and you're showing them this chart, what would they think, right? I mean, you would look at this chart and be like, well, what did you miss, right? These are all just lower highs that have sort of transpired. Doesn't mean it can't eventually turn into something different, and it probably will, right? I mean, I do think ADA Bitcoin has a good chance of actually going up in 2025. If you look at yearly candles, let's take a look at this. When did ADA Bitcoin go up last cycle? When did it really go up? Don't give me this, 30% move with a wick to the upside, right? When did it really go up? 2021. When did it go up the cycle before that? 2017. So maybe it's just 2017, 2021, 2025, right? So I do want people to be aware of that outcome where, like, ADA Bitcoin gets this correction that it's in right now, and it kind of fades for a little bit, and then perhaps it starts to show renewed strength whenever QE returns, right? And it's just something, I've obviously thought a lot about, and I remember kind of what it did over here, right? It had this spike, right? It had this spike, and then it did a lower low, in December, January, and then it went up. So it's hard to say, right? It's hard to say, but you can kind of see where I'm coming from, right? Where you get, and again, like just because it was a lower low over here doesn't mean it has to be a lower low over here. It's all about just like when is it weak, when is it strong. And here it was strong in November, just like it was over here. And then it was weak in December, just like it is right now. And you can see that ADA Bitcoin basically went down every week of December. And it bottomed early January of 2021. If you're curious and you want to look at the day that it bottomed in 2021, right? The day that ADA Bitcoin bottomed right here, and not the actual bottom, but like this low before it really started to move up, was January 3rd. Okay, January 3rd. So I wouldn't be that surprised to see some of these altcoins find renewed strength about a year after the launch of the Bitcoin ETF on their Bitcoin pairs, right? I wouldn't be that surprised to see some of these alts find renewed strength on their Bitcoin pairs about a year after the launch of the spot ETF for Bitcoin. So keep this idea in mind. Keep this idea in mind for ADA Bitcoin. For ADA USD, as I said previously, at the very least, you were going to retest this, which we have, because that's exactly what happened last year, right? And I still am of the opinion, right? Like if it's not broke, try not to fix it, right? Just kind of defer to the market, try to listen to what the market's telling you, and say, there's also a chance it could go lower, especially if it follows what it did last cycle, right? Where it had a deeper correction. In terms of percent, this drop was about a 56% drop, right? So if it were to drop 56%, that would actually put you below 60 cents, right? Which would actually put you right in here, which is right where it went last time, right? When it had this drop, it went right in here. You see what I'm saying? Now, there is a scenario where, it continues to expand on the broadening wedge. And I don't really want to spend too much time harping on this scenario because I don't really want to make people mad. But there's always a chance that it just kind of comes back down here because Powell just says, nope, no QE, continue on playing in the sandbox in the Cryptoverse, and we'll give you QE sometime later on. There's a chance that happens. But, I do think that even if that were to happen, you could still get a scenario like this where you get sort of like another double top type of a thing where it continues to climb it, right? Something like that could play out. Furthermore, the other thing to look at is the bull market support band, right? The bull market support band for ADA Bitcoin, you can see that first of all, it wicked below it over here, but it had a weekly close right around the 20-week SMA. Over here, it was just above the 21-week EMA. So I would also keep an eye on that. And the 20-week SMA for ADA is around 56 cents. The 21-week EMA is around 67 cents. So that would also correspond to kind of like right back in there. Okay, so just keep an eye on that as well. And we'll take it one step at a time. Obviously, I don't have a crystal ball. If you find someone with a crystal ball, I would not tell anyone about them because hopefully they can make you a lot of money. We're just over here dubiously speculating about things, trying to figure out what's what and who's who in the Cryptoverse, and also trying to make sense of Bitcoin dominance, because I think you start off your first cycle not really caring about Bitcoin dominance. Once you've really lived through it for an entire cycle and you see the altcoin that you really like just kind of bleed against Bitcoin, you then start to recognize, all right, hey, maybe there's something to this Bitcoin dominant stuff. And I know that last cycle, dominance topped. It had two tops, right? The first top was when QE ended, and the second top was January of the post-halving year. I'd like to present an idea, and I've done this a few times. What if these two tops end up being the same top this cycle, right? What if they end up being the same top, where QE returns, hopefully sometime early 2025, but then you also get this seasonal top, January of the post-halving year. And what happens if it just ends up looking like that, where, you kind of go up and you put another high, that ends up being the top, and then it just kind of does something like that? Is that possible? Maybe. Bitcoin dominance for me, 60% was always the target. And that's why I don't really feel compelled too strongly to say that, ADA Bitcoin, it's not like it has to go back down to 400 sats, because, if you look at like sort of the fib retracement here, the Bitcoin dominance already retraced to the 618 fib, just like last cycle. If you look at the bubble of alts against Bitcoin that began right here, you can see that dominance retraced that entire move. But the sort of the elephant, right, is that if alt Bitcoin pairs do eventually return to the range low, then, it's going to be hard to see alt Bitcoin pairs down here without ADA Bitcoin also taking a big hit, right? And just remember, ADA Bitcoin alt Bitcoin pairs were at 0.25 around this time last cycle. And they were also at this level in October of 2017 and in September of 2019 and in June of 2020, right? So it can happen. I would argue, again, as I said earlier, right, if it doesn't happen, if we don't go down here, which we don't have to, right? I mean, I'm satisfied with dominance at 60%, right? I am. And I don't know if I'm trying to convince you or me, honestly, but I'm satisfied with it. But what I would say is that if alt Bitcoin pairs don't go down here, then they also probably don't go up here, okay? And you can kind of understand that by looking at the XRP Bitcoin valuation from earlier, right? You don't have to go to the range low, but if you don't, you're probably not going to go to the range high. The way you go to the range high is you get these massive capitulations by alt Bitcoin pairs that make everyone think that altcoins are truly dead on their Bitcoin pairs. And then just when you least expect it, alt season begins, right? And again, last cycle, alt season occurred in January 2021. Cycle before that, it didn't really occur until Q4 of the post-halving year. So there's no guarantee that you get an alt season immediately in January, right? It could be delayed until later on. But I did at least want to talk about alt Bitcoin pairs. I wanted to talk about Cardano, not only on its USD pair, but also on its Bitcoin pair. Arguably, the Bitcoin pair is, in fact, more important than the USD pair, but I do know a lot of you guys are more so interested in the USD valuation of ADA. But anyways, guys, we'll try to wrap it up there. We'll follow this wedge pattern here and kind of see what happens. Historically, if you believe that this is sort of an ascending, broadening wedge, which to some degree I have trouble believing it just because, there's kind of a fake out here. Historically, they break up a little more. Sorry, they break up maybe like 46, 47% of the time. They break down a little more than 50% of the time. Last cycle, you can see that it did break down, right? And a real breakdown, not just kind of like this. But there are times where they don't really break down. And this is based on Forex markets, where they do eventually break to the upside. So again, this is all just chasing one narrative after another. Neither side getting what they want. We'll try to remain objective and unbiased over here as best as I can. All right. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe. Give the video a thumbs up. Again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. And if you're interested in altcoins in general, if you're interested in Cardano or any other altcoin, we have a lot of altcoins over here. You can actually click on one. For instance, since this video is about ADA, you can click on ADA, and then any chart that pops up here would be a chart, in fact, on ADA, right? So if you're curious about, say, like the HODL waves for Cardano, and you want to know what are long-term holders doing, right? I don't care what people are saying on X. I don't care what people are saying on YouTube. I want to know what people are actually doing, right? There's I'm not going to say it. But anyways, you can see that long-term holders, regardless of what they're telling you, right? Regardless of what they're telling you on Twitter, there are some long-term holders selling into this pump. I mean, you can see it, right? I mean, you can see the HODL waves. I mean, you can see that, they are, right? They're going down. And I mean, it could be an artifact, too, of just short-term holders coming to the party. You can see that short-term holders are starting to go up a little bit here. Which is a little different than what you saw in last year, right? You didn't even really see any return of short-term holders last year. You're getting a little bit of a return this year, but it's still not what you saw in 2021, and it's certainly not what you saw in 2017, early 2018. But again, like, you can go through these charts for Cardano, you could go through them for other altcoins, and you can try to figure out, what's going on. I don't have all the time in the world to explain every single altcoin on here, go through every single chart. But if you are curious about an altcoin and you want to explore it, you want to research it, we do have a lot of the tools on ITC Premium. We are running the sale. We'll continue to run that. Make sure you guys check it out. Link in the description below, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.